The Club of Rome has succeeded in splitting the Christian churches. It has succeeded in building up an army of charismatics, fundamentalists, and evangelicals who will fight for the Zionist state of Israel. During the Gulf War of genocide, I received scores of letters asking me how I could oppose a just Christian war against Iraq. How could I doubt that Christian fundamentalist support for the Committee of 300's war against Iraq was not biblical? After all, didn't Billy Graham pray with President Bush just before the shooting started? Doesn't the Bible speak of wars and rumors of wars? These letters give an insight into just how well the Tavistock Institute has done its work. The Christian fundamentalists will be a formidable force behind the State of Israel, exactly as planned. How sad that these fine people do not realize that they have been grossly misused by the Club of Rome and that their opinions and beliefs are not their own, but those created for them by the hundreds of Committee of 300 think tanks that dot the American landscape. In other words, like any other segment of the United States population, the Christian fundamentalists and evangelicals have been thoroughly brainwashed. We as a nation are ready to accept the demise of the United States of America and the American way of life, once the envy of the entire world. Do not think this has happened on its own. The old times are changing syndrome. Time does not change anything, people do. It is a mistake to think of the Committee of 300 and the Club of Rome as European institutions. The Club of Rome exercises great influence and power in the United States and has its own chapter based in Washington, D.C. Senator Claiborne Pell is its leader, and one of its members is Frank M. Potter, a one-time staff director of the House Subcommittee on Energy. It is not difficult to see how the Club of Rome has maintained its grip on U.S. energy policies and where environmentalist opposition to nuclear energy is coming from. Perhaps the club's greatest success story is its hold over Congress in regard to nuclear energy, which has had the effect of preventing the U.S. from entering the 21st century as a strong industrial nation. The effect of the anti-nuclear policy of the Club of Rome can be measured in terms of silent blast furnaces, derelict railroad yards, rusting steel mills, shipyards long since closed down, and a valuable trained workforce scattered across the United States, which may never again be assembled. Other Club of Rome members in the U.S. are Walter A. Hahn of the Congressional Research Service, Ann Cheatham and Douglas Ross, both senior economists. Ross's task, in his own words, was to translate Club of Rome perspectives into legislation to help the country get away from the illusion of plenty. Ann Cheatham was the director of an organization called Congressional Clearinghouse for the Future. Her task was to profile members of Congress who would be susceptible to astrology and New Age mumbo-jumbo. At one stage, she had in excess of 100 congressmen in her classes. Daily sessions were held in which a variety of astrological forecasts were made based on her occult perceptions. Besides congressmen, other prominent people who attended her sessions were Michael Walsh, Thornton Bradshaw, a leading member of the Committee of 300, and David Sternlight, a senior vice president of Allstate Insurance Company. Especially in the 1980 election, every candidate for the highest office in the United States was run by the CFR. Therefore, it was of no consequence to the conspirators who won the presidential race. Through such Trojan horses as the Heritage Foundation and the CFR, all key policy-making positions in the new administrations were filled by the Council on Foreign Relations nominees, and before that, since the 1960 ES, by NATO Club of Rome yes-men, thereby ensuring that key policy decisions bore the indelible stamp of the Club of Rome and the CFR, acting as the executive arms of the Committee of 300. Both the 1984 and 1988 elections followed this long-established pattern. Secretary of State George Shultz was the perfect choice of the Committee of 300 for the office of Secretary of State. Shultz was always a creature of Henry Kissinger, the ruling order giver for the CFR. Moreover, his position with Bechtel, a key committee of 300 company of global dimensions, gave him access to countries that might otherwise have been suspicious of his Kissinger connection. The Carter administration accelerated the process of key pro-conspiracy personnel in key positions. Before Carter was elected, his key campaign strategist, Hamilton Jordan, said that if Cyrus Vance or Brzezinski received appointments in the Carter cabinet, he, Jordan, would resign. They did. Jordan did not resign. Carter's choice of Paul Volcker, in fact he was told to appoint Volcker by David Rockefeller, started the collapse of the U.S. economy according to the plan laid down by the Club of Rome. We are up against powerful forces who are dedicated to the goal of a one-world government. We have been engaged in a devastatingly crippling war for the past 45 years, only it is not perceived as such. We are brainwashed, methodically and systematically, without ever being aware of it. The Tavistock Institute provided the system for this to take place and then set its operations in motion. The only way we can fight back is by exposing the conspirators and their multiplicity of front organizations. We need men with experience who can formulate strategy to defend our priceless heritage, which, once lost, will never again reappear. We need to learn the methods the conspirators use, learn them, and adopt countermeasures. Only a crash program will stop the rot which is consuming our nation. Some may have difficulty in accepting the idea of a global conspiracy because so many writers have made financial gain from it. Others doubt that activity on a global scale can be successfully advanced. They see the huge bureaucracy of our government and then say, well, how are we supposed to believe that private people can do more than the government does? This overlooks the fact that government is part of the conspiracy. Hard evidence is what they want, and hard evidence is difficult to come by. Others say, so what? What do I care about a conspiracy? I don't even bother to vote. That is exactly the way the general population of America was profiled to react. Our people have become discouraged and confused, the results of 45 years of warfare conducted against us. How this is done is explained in Bernard Lewin's book, but how many people would bother to read an academic's nonfiction book? We are reacting exactly as we were profiled to act. Demoralized and confused people will be far more ready to welcome the sudden appearance of a great man who promises to solve every problem and guarantee a well-ordered society in which people are fully employed and domestic strife is minimal. Their dictator, for that is who it will be welcomed with open arms. Knowing who the enemy is a vital necessity. No one can fight and against an unidentified enemy. This book could be used as a military field manual. Study its content and memorize all names. I have mentioned profiling techniques quite frequently in this chapter. A full explanation of profiling is contained in the next chapter. One of the most profound pieces of information to come out of the science of profiling is the relative ease in which this can be accomplished in individuals, party groups, political entities, and so on, right on down the line. Once we wake up as to how easy this is to do, the conspiracy will no longer be more than we can comprehend. The assassination of President Kennedy and the attempt on the life of President Reagan become easy to understand. Institute lawns through which control is exercised. Profiling is a technique developed in 1922 on command of the Royal Institute for International Affairs, RIIA. Major John Rawlings Rees, a British Army technician, was instructed to set up the largest brainwashing facility in the world at the Tavistock Institute for Human Relations as a part of Sussex University. This became the core of Britain's Psychological Warfare Bureau. When I first introduced the names of Rees and Tavistock into the United States in 1970, very little interest was shown. But over the years, as I revealed more and more about Tavistock and its vital role in the conspiracy, it has become popular to imitate my earlier research. Britain's Psychological Warfare Bureau made extensive use of the work done by Rees on his 80,000 British Army guinea pigs, captive soldiers who underwent many forms of testing. It was Tavistock-designed methods that got the United States into the Second World War, and which, under the guidance of Dr. Kurt Lewin, established the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA. Lewin became the director of the Strategic Bombing Survey, which was a plan for the Royal Air Force to concentrate on bombing German worker housing while leaving military targets, such as munition plants, alone. The munition plants on both sides belonged to the international bankers who had no wish to see their assets destroyed. Later, after the war was over, NATO ordered Sussex University to establish a very special brainwashing center which became part of Britain's Psychological Warfare Bureau. Only now, its research was directed towards civilian rather than military applications. We shall return to that super-secret unit, which was called Science Policy Research Institute, SPRI, under our chapters on drugs. The idea behind saturation bombing of civilian worker housing was to break the morale of the German worker. It was not designed to affect the war effort against the German military machine. Lewin and his team of actuaries reached a target figure that if 65% of German worker housing was destroyed by nightly RAF bombing, the morale of the civilian population would collapse. The actual document was prepared by the Prudential Assurance Company. The RAF, under the command of Bomber Harris, carried out Lewin's plans, culminating in the terror firestorm bombing of Dresden, in which over 125,000, mainly old men, women, and children, were killed. The truth of Bomber Harris's horror raids on German civilians was a well-kept secret until long after the end of WW2. Tavistock provided most of the detailed programs that led to the establishing of the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, the #1 intelligence service in the United States, one which dwarfs the CIA in size and scope. Contracts worth billions of dollars were given to Tavistock by the United States government, and Tavistock's strategic planners provide most of what the Pentagon uses for our defense establishment, even today. Here again is illustrated the grip the Committee of 300 has on the United States and the majority of our institutions. Tavistock runs over 30 research institutions in the United States, all of which we will name in our charts at the end of the book. These Tavistock U.S. institutions have in many cases grown into gargantuan monsters, penetrating every aspect of our government agencies and taking command of all policymaking. One of Tavistock's chief wreckers of our way of life was Dr. Alexander King, a founder member of NATO and a favorite with the Committee of 300, as well as an outstanding member of the Club of Rome. Dr. King was assigned by the Club of Rome to destroy America's education by taking control of the National Teachers Association and working in close conjunction with certain lawmakers and judges. If it was not generally known how all-pervading is the influence of the Committee of 300, this book should dispel every vestige of that doubt. The trial run for the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, a Club of Rome creation, came in a test run against the nuclear power station at 3 Mile Island, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Termed an accident by the hysterical media, this was not an accident, but a deliberately designed crisis test for FEMA. An additional benefit was the fear and hysteria created by the news media, which had people fleeing the area when in fact they were never in any danger. It was considered a success by FEMA, and it scored a lot of points for the anti-nuclear forces. TMI became the rallying point for the so-called environmentalists, a highly financed and controlled group run out of Aspen Institute on behalf of the Club of Rome. Coverage was provided free of charge by William Paley of CBS Television, a former British intelligence agent. FEMA is a natural successor to the Strategic Bombing Survey of WW2. Dr. Kurt Lewin, theoretician for what the Tavistock conspirators called crisis management, was deeply involved in the study. There is an unbroken chain between Lewin and Tavistock that stretches back for 37 years. Lewin incorporated the Strategic Bombing Survey into FEMA, with only a few small adjustments proving necessary, one of the changes being the target, which was no longer Germany, but the United States of America. 45 years after the end of WW2, it is still Tavistock that has its hands on the trigger, and the weapon is pointed at the United States. The late Margaret Mead conducted an intensive study of the German and Japanese population under the aegis of Tavistock on how they reacted to stress caused by aerial bombardment. Irving Janis was an associate professor on the project, which was supervised by Dr. John Rawlings Rees, promoted to brigadier general in the British Army. The test results were given to FEMA. The Irving Janis report was of great value in formulating FEMA policies. Janus used it in a book which he later wrote entitled AIR, War and Stress. The ideas in his book were followed to the letter by FEMA during the 3 Mile Island crisis. Janus had a really simple idea: simulate a succession of crises and manipulate the population following the Lewin terror tactics, and they will do exactly as required. In carrying out this exercise, Lewin discovered something new: that social control on a wide scale can be achieved by using the news media to bring home the horrors of a nuclear war via the television media. It was discovered that women's magazines were very effective in dramatizing the terrors of a nuclear war. A trial run conducted by Janus had Betty Bumpers, wife of Senator Dale Bumpers of Arkansas, writing for McCall's magazine on that subject. The article appeared in McCall's January 1983 issue. Actually, Mrs. Bumpers did not write the article. It was created for her by a group of writers at Tavistock whose speciality such subject matters are. It was a collection of untruths, non-facts, innuendos, and conjectures based entirely upon false premises. The Bumpers article was typical of the kind of psychological manipulation at which Tavistock is so very good. Not one of the ladies who read McCall's could have failed to be impressed by the terror-horror story of what a nuclear war looks like. The Committee of 300 has a major bureaucracy at its disposal, made up of hundreds of think tanks and front organizations that run the whole gamut of private business and government leaders. I will mention as many as I can fit in, starting with the German Marshall Fund. Its members, and remember they are also members of NATO and the Club of Rome, consist of David Rockefeller of Chase Manhattan Bank, Gabriel Haig of the prestigious Manufacturers Hanover Trust and Finance Corporation, Milton Katz of the Ford Foundation, Willy Brandt, leader of Socialist International, KGB agent and member of the Committee of 300, Irving Bluestone, chairman of the United Auto Workers Executive Board, Russell Train, U.S. President of the Club of Rome, and Prince Philip's World Wildlife Fund, Elizabeth Midgley, CBS Programs producer, B.R. Gifford, director of the Russell Sage Foundation, Guido Goldman of the Aspen Institute, the late Avril Harriman, Committee of 300 extraordinary member, Thomas L. Hughes of the Carnegie Endowment Fund, Dennis Meadows, and Jay Forrester of MIT World Dynamics. The Committee of 300, although in existence for over 150 years, did not take on its present form until around 1897. It was always given to issuing orders through other fronts, such as the Royal Institute for International Affairs. When it was decided that a superbody would control European affairs, the RIIA founded the Tavistock Institute, which in turn created NATO. For 5 years, NATO was financed by the German Marshall Fund. Perhaps the most important member of the Bilderbergers, a foreign policy body of the committee, was Joseph Rettinger, said to have been its founder and organizer, whose annual meetings have delighted conspiracy hunters for several decades. Rettinger was a well-trained Jesuit priest and a 33rd-degree Freemason. Mrs. Catherine Meyer Graham, who is suspected of having murdered her husband in order to get control of the Washington Post, was another ranking member of the Club of Rome, as was Paul G. Hoffman of the New York Life Insurance Company, one of the largest insurance companies in the United States and a leading rank company, with ties directly to Queen Elizabeth of England's immediate family. John J. McCloy, the man who attempted to wipe Post, World War II Germany off the map, and last but not least, James A. Perkins of the Carnegie Corporation, were also founding members of the Bilderbergers and the Club of Rome. What a star-studded cast! Yet strangely enough, few, if any, outside of genuine intelligence agencies had ever heard of this organization until recent times. The power exercised by these important personages and the corporations, television stations, newspapers, insurance companies, and banks they represent matches the power and prestige of at least 2 European countries. And still, this is only the tip of the Committee of 300's enormous cross-gridding and interfaced interests. Not mentioned in the foregoing lineup is Richard Gardner, who, although an early member of the Committee of 300, was sent to Rome on a special assignment. Gardner married into one of the oldest black nobility families of Venice, thus providing the Venetian aristocracy a direct line to the White House. The late Averell Harriman was another of the committee's direct links with the Kremlin and the White House, a position which Kissinger inherited after the death of Harriman. The Club of Rome is indeed a formidable agency of the Committee of 300. Although ostensibly working on American affairs, the group overlaps other Committee of 300 agencies, and its United States members are often found working with problems in Japan and Germany. Some of the front organizations operated by the above committee include the following, although not limited to them. League of Industrial Democracy officials: Michael Novak, Jeane Kirkpatrick, Eugene Rostow, Erwin Sewall, Lane Kirkland, Albert Schenker. Purpose: to disrupt and disturb normal labor relations between workers and employees by brainwashing labor unions to make impossible demands with special attention to steel, automobile, and housing industries. Freedom House officials: Leo Chern and Carl Gershman. Purpose: to spread socialist disinformation among American blue-collar workers, spread dissension and dissatisfaction. Now that these objectives have been largely realized, Gershman has been drafted by Lawrence Eagleburger to CEDC, a newly created body to stop a united Germany from expanding its trade into the Danube Basin. Committee for a Democratic Majority officials: Ben Wattenberg, Jeane Kirkpatrick, Elmo Zumwalt, and Midge Decter. Purpose: to provide a connecting link between the educated socialist class and minority groups with the intent of setting up a solid block of voters who can be counted on to vote for left-wing candidates at election time. It was really a Fabianist operation from start to finish. Foreign Policy Research Institute officials: Robert Strauss Hoopa. Purpose: to undermine and eventually end NASA space program. Social Democrats USA officials: Bayard Rustin, Lane Kirkland, Jay Lovestone, Carl Gershman, Howard Samuel, Sidney Hook. Purpose: to spread radical socialism, especially among minority groups, and forge links between similar organizations in socialist countries. Lovestone was for decades the leading advisor to U.S. presidents on Soviet affairs and a strong direct link with Moscow. Institute for Social Relations officials: Harland Cleveland, Willis Harman. Purpose: change the way America thinks. The Citizens League officials: Barry Commoner. Purpose: to bring common cause legal suits against various government agencies, especially in the defense industries. War Resisters League officials: Noam Chomsky and David McReynolds. Purpose: to organize resistance to the Vietnam War among left-wing groups, students, and the Hollywood in crowd. The Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee of the Institute for Democratic Socialism. Officials: Frank Zeider, Arthur Radier, and David McReynolds. Purpose: a clearinghouse for left-wing socialist ideas and activities in the U.S. and Europe. Anti-Defamation League Fact-Finding Division officials: Erwin Sewall, also known as John Graham. Purpose: a joint FBI British intelligence operation designed to single out right-wing groups and their leaders and put them out of business before they grow too large and too influential. International Association of Machinists. Purpose: a labor-oriented front for the Socialist International and a hotbed of organized labor unrest polarizing workers and management. Amalgamated Clothing Workers officials: Murray Findlay, Erwin Sewall, and Jacob Schenkman. Purpose: much the same as the Machinists' Union, to socialize and polarize workers in the garment trade. A. Philip Randolph Institute officials: Bayard Rustin. Purpose: to provide a means of coordinating organizations with a common purpose, an example of which would be the spread of socialist ideas among college students and workers. Cambridge Policy Studies Institute officials: Gar Appelrovitz. Purpose: to expand on the work being done at the Institute for Policy Studies. Founded in February 1969 by international socialist Gar Appelrovitz, former assistant to Senator Gaylord Nelson. Appelrovitz wrote the controversial book Atomic Diplomacy for the Club of Rome, which work was financed by the German Marshall Fund. It concentrates on research and action projects, with a stated goal of fundamentally changing American society, i.e., to create a Fabianist United States in preparation of the coming one-world government. Economic Committee of the North Atlantic Institute officials: Dr. Aurelio Peche. Purpose: NATO think tank on global economic issues. Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions. Officials: founder Robert Hutchins of the Committee of 300, Harry Ashmore, Frank Kelly, and a large group of fellows. Purpose: to spread ideas that will bring on social reforms of the liberal kind with democracy as an ideology. One of its activities is to draft a new constitution for the U.S., which will be strongly monarchical and socialistic as found in Denmark. The center is an Olympian stronghold. Located in Santa Barbara, it is housed in what is affectionately called the Parthenon. Former Representative John Rarick called it an outfit loaded with communists. By 1973, work on a new United States Constitution was in its 35th draft, which proposes an amendment guaranteeing environmental right, the thrust of which is to reduce the industrial base of the U.S. to a mere whisper of what it was in 1969. In other words, this institution is carrying out Club of Rome zero-growth post-industrial policies laid down by the Committee of 300. Some of its other aims are control of economic cycles, welfare, regulation of business and national public works, control of pollution. Speaking on behalf of the Committee of 300, Ashmore says the function of the CSDI is to find ways and means of making our political system work more effectively. We must change education, and we must consider a new U.S. Constitution and a constitution for the world, Ashmore says. Further goals enunciated by Ashmore are as follows. 1. Membership of the UN must be made universal. 2. The UN must be strengthened. 3. Southeast Asia must be neutralized. For neutralized, read communized. 4. Cold War must be ended. 5. Racial discrimination must be abolished. 6. Developing nations must be assisted, meaning assisted to destruct. 7. No military solutions to problems. Pity they didn't tell George Bush that before the Gulf War. 8. National solutions are not adequate. 9. Coexistence is necessary. Harvard Psychological Clinic officials, Dr. Kurt Lewin and staff of 15 new science scientists. Purpose: to create a climate where the Committee of 300 can take unlimited power over the U.S. Institute for Social Research officials, Dr. Kurt Lewin and staff of 20 new science scientists. Purpose: to devise a whole new set of social programs to steer America away from industry. Science Policy Research Unit officials, Leland Bradford, Kenneth Dam, Ronald Lippert. Purpose: a future shocks research institution at Sussex University in England and part of the Tavistock Network. Systems Development Corporation officials, Sheldon Ehrenberg and a staff of hundreds, too numerous to mention here. Purpose: to coordinate all elements of the intelligence communities of the USA and Britain. It analyzes what players have to be assigned the role of a national entity. For example, Spain would come under a supine, watered-down Catholic Church, the UN under the Secretary General, and so forth. It developed the system of X-ray 2 inches, where think tank personnel, military installations, and law enforcement centers are all linked to the Pentagon through a nationwide network of teletypes and computers, to apply surveillance techniques on a nationwide scale. Ehrenberg says his ideas are non-military, but his techniques are mainly those he learned from the military. He was responsible for the New York State Identification and Intelligence System, a typical George Orwell 1,984 inches project, which is completely illegal under our Constitution. The NYSIS system is in the process of being adopted nationwide. It is what Brzezinski referred to as the ability to almost instantaneously retrieve data about any person. NYSIS shares data with all law enforcement and government agencies in the state. It provides storage and rapid retrieval of individual records, criminal and social. It is a typical Committee of 300 project. There is a crying need for a full investigation to be conducted into just what it is that Systems Development Corporation is doing, but that is beyond the scope of this book. One thing is sure, SDC is not there to preserve freedom and liberty guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. How convenient that it should be located in Santa Barbara in easy reach of Robert Hutchins' Parthenon. Some publications put out by these Club of Rome institutions are as follows: Center Magazine, Counter Spy, Coventry, Covert Action Information Bulletin, Dissent, Human Relations, Industrial Research, Inquiry, Mother Jones, One, Progressive, Raconteur, The New Republic, Working Papers for a New Society. These are by no means all of the publications issued under the auspices of the Club of Rome. There are many hundreds more. In fact, each of the foundations puts out its own publication. Given the number of foundations run by the Tavistock Institute and the Club of Rome, a partial listing is all we can include here. Some of the more important foundations and think tanks are in the following list, which includes Army think tanks. The American public would be astounded if it only knew how deeply the Army is involved in new war tactics research with Committee of 300 think tanks. Americans are not aware that in 1946, the Club of Rome was ordered by the Committee of 300 to further the progress of think tanks, which it said offered a new means of spreading the committee's philosophy. The impact of these think tanks upon our military, just since 1959 when they suddenly proliferated, is truly astounding. There is no doubt that they will play an even greater role in the daily affairs of this nation as we come to the close of the 20th century. The Mont Pelerin Society. Mont Pelerin is an economic foundation devoted to issuing misleading economic theories and influencing economists in the Western world to follow models it lays out from time to time. Its leading practitioners are von Hayek and Milton Friedman. The Hoover Institution. Founded originally to fight communism, the institution has slowly but surely turned towards socialism. It has an annual budget of $2 million, funded by companies under the umbrella of the Committee of 300. It now concentrates on peaceful changes, with emphasis on arms control and domestic U.S. problems. It is frequently used by the news media as a conservative organization whose views they seek when a conservative viewpoint is needed. The Hoover Institution is far from that, and following the 1953 takeover of the institution by a group allied to the Club of Rome, it has become a one-world new world order outlet for desirable policies. Heritage Foundation. Founded by brewery magnate Joseph Coors to act as a conservative think tank, Heritage was soon taken over by Fabianists Sir Peter Vickers Hall, Stuart Butler, Stephen Isley, Robert Moss, and Frederick von Hayek, under the direction of the Club of Rome. This institute played a major role in carrying out British Labour leader Anthony Wedgwood Benn's order to Thatcherize Reagan. Heritage is certainly not a conservative operation, although at times it may look and sound like one. Human Resources Research Office. This is an Army research establishment dealing in psychotechnology. Most of its personnel are Tavistock trained. Psychotechnology covers GI motivation, morale, and music used by the enemy. In fact, a lot of what George Orwell wrote about in his book, 1984 Inches, appears to be remarkably similar to what is taught at Humro. In 1969, the Committee of 300 took over this important institution and turned it into a private, non-profit organization run under the auspices of the Club of Rome. It is the largest behavioral research group in the U.S. One of its specialities is the study of small groups under stress, and Humro teaches the Army that a soldier is merely an extension of his equipment and has brought great influence to bear on the man-weapon system and its human quality control, so widely accepted by the United States Army. Humro has had a very pronounced effect on how the Army conducts itself. Its mind-bending techniques are straight out of Tavistock. Humro's applied psychology courses are supposed to teach Army brass how to make the human weapon work. A good example of this is the manner in which soldiers in the war against Iraq were willing to disobey their field manual standing orders and bury 12,000 Iraqi soldiers alive. This type of brainwashing is terribly dangerous because today it is applied to the Army. The Army applies it to brutally destroy thousands of enemy soldiers, and tomorrow the Army could be told that civilian population groups opposed to government policies are the enemy. We are already a mindless, brainwashed flock of sheep, yet it seems that Humro can take mind-bending and mind control a step further. Humro is a valuable adjunct to Tavistock, and many of the lessons taught at Humro were applied in the Gulf War, which makes it a little easier to understand how it came to be that American soldiers behaved as ruthless and heartless killers, a far cry from the concept of the traditional American fighting man.